My name is Cheryl Hatch. Thank you so much for coming. Do we have veterans in the house today? How many veterans in the house? Hands in the air. My professor is coming out. Right on, so thank you. And when I say thank you, I always say thank you to both the service people and to their families, because as the daughter of a career military officer and a Vietnam vet, I know the sacrifices that the families make as well as the people who serve. So I'm really proud and delighted to be here, especially on Veterans Day. I was previously an educator, a professor at Allegheny College, and now I teach at Guilford College in North Carolina. So I flew up here because I love Meadville so much and because y'all invited me back. So yeah, what I wanted to talk about today was my childhood. This theme is on the home front. So that's my childhood, and then tell you a little bit about how my childhood inspired my life and my career. So how growing up as an Army brat led to me becoming a war photographer is the sexy term people use. I'm not such a fan of it, but it is what it is. So I'm going to tell you my personal story and then show you some of my work. All right? Cool. So I'm going to start, and there's some slides here. You don't necessarily have to read them. I'm going to go through them slowly, but I'm going to tell you the gist of the slide. How many people know this quote by Theodore Roosevelt about the man in the arena, right? So I now always insert woman because, that was back in the day, the 1900s. So now when I read this, I also say woman. The woman's in the arena as well. But my dad gave this to me when I was in middle school. And it guided my life ever since. Not so much, this is going to be interesting. Right? This is the part. So if he or she fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his or her place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. So what I took away from that, because I was also raised, I'm super competitive, I'm a type A personality, I'm a straight A student, so I was raised that way. But I also was raised to say, go for it, right? Take the risks, make the failures, scrape your knees, don't cry, get up and get back out there. So that's how I was raised. And many times looking back, I think, dang, that was hard. Yeah, it was hard, but it also made me who I am today. So this is who I am, or where I came from. Mom and Dad and me. So I'm an Army brat, and I'm the daughter of a career officer, combat engineer, Vietnam veteran, and that's his beautiful bride. My mom, who gave up a career in teaching, or dreams of a career in teaching, to raise 4 kids, because that's what it took. And we moved more than 20 times before I graduated from high school. So I was the perpetual new kid. If anybody knows what that feels like, you're constantly moving, you're always the new kid. Yep. So kind of, again, was not fun as a kid, but I realized later in life that really helped me be able to read situations and people and decide, who I wanted to hang out with and who I didn't. So this is me as a young girl, right? And then I grew up, there's one more. So this was the family Christmas picture circa 1967, and my dad was not there. So if you can imagine, back in the day, that was his second tour, and they kicked us off the base. Back in the day, they wouldn't let you stay on the base if your husband was overseas. So my mom with 4 kids, including a very small one, in a new place with no family, no support, right, with 4 kids. So this is us at Christmas with no dad. And back then you had to write letters and then wait for the letters to come back. It would be months, right? Sometimes there'd be a reel-to-reel tape that would come in the mail, and we could listen to that, hear his voice, but not the communication, the instant communication that you have now. So, hang on. I love my books, right? This is Fort Leavenworth. Anybody know Fort Leavenworth? Yep. And then even as I grew up, right, I'm still clutching my books. But I think the way that I was raised, traveling, meeting new people, gave me this sense of adventure and this curiosity, but I was also raised with some rigor, shall we say, some discipline. So we were taught to respect authority, to respect our elders, to not talk back. And the number one rule in my family was tell the truth, followed by its corollary, which is be accountable, which means if you make a mistake, you better stand up and own it. Nothing is worse than lying, and second to that is if you screw up, you better stand up straight and tell me what you did and take the consequences. So I decided, that and military police. You remember the military police on the forts? I got very good at dodging the military police at curfew. So I think that's also excellent training for a journalist. I know how to respect the rules, and I know how to avoid getting caught when I'm not respecting the rules. So it's a good training. But having said that, when I got ready to go to school, I decided, what kind of career do I want? I had grown up seeing the war, the Vietnam War, on the television, and I can remember as a kid I used to look for my dad, right? Like look for my dad's face, or hopefully not my dad's body. So the entire sort of my childhood is a black and white war on the television, and when my dad came back, he never talked about it. And all these many years later, if I can get one sentence out of my dad, it's a shocker. Now as he's getting a little older, every once in a while I might be able to get some piece of information from him. But I think part of that not knowing, like this thing called war that took my dad away from me for so long and sort of left us alone for so long, what is this thing? So in the end, I think that this combination of a commitment to truth and accountability followed with this curiosity is what sort of shaped my career as a journalist. So the first thing I learned as an Army brat, but then what I learned as a journalist, which I think is important for life, be curious. And I think now more than ever, to be curious means to be open-minded and have an open heart. And not just listen to people with your ears, but hear them with your hearts and go into a place and try to understand people who are different or situations that you've never experienced before. So being a new kid taught me that, and being a journalist was just, I got to expand on that. My first war, I went to Liberia in 1990, and when I got there, I was like all of a sudden, okay, not my childhood war, right? Not the black and white war that I'd seen on the TV. And I wasn't prepared for it at all. I didn't know what I was doing. And when I first got there, my hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't take a picture and couldn't focus. And those are way back in the day, you had to focus by hand, right? It was not autofocus back then. So I made all this journey to get there, and I couldn't do my job. But I figured it out. So there's a couple, so as I show you these pictures, I won't linger on them too long. Some of them are harder to look at than others, but I want to show you the work, talk about it a little bit, and then I'm keeping track of the time, leave time for you to ask a few questions if you want. Does anybody have any questions before I move forward? Ready? Set? Here we go. Okay. See? So this woman I show because her name is Cecilia. And when I met her in Liberia, she was 6 months pregnant, and she was carrying a gun. And so I had a very strong judgment about that, coming from my world to her world. And I was like, what are you doing, carrying an unborn life and a weapon of death? And so she took me back and it had me sit with other women fighters, and we had tea and we talked. And she said, I'm fighting for my child's future, right? So it gave me a new perspective, a different perspective of war, but also about the people who are sort of caught in the middle of it. And I would include families like my own, like the children who are left behind, right? So is it an accident that I grew up to be someone who covered conflict? Is it an accident that I grew up to be somebody who cared about civilians and refugees and the people who got caught in the crossfire. And then later on, is it a coincidence that I ended up going to Afghanistan and covering, the men and women in combat? No, I think that pretty much all comes out of my childhood as an Army brat. But Cecilia, after I met Cecilia, I decided, no, I want to cover the aftermath of war, what's left. But I was a woman photojournalist at a time when there weren't many women photojournalists. And I learned, both as a child, this is where the dodging the military police comes in, but also as I grew up, to be resourceful. It's important to be resourceful. I wanted to go to the, the Gulf War wanted to go to northern Iraq after the Gulf War, the first. And I didn't have any money. I didn't have any way to do it. Come on down. But I cared about the story because there were so many people who had fled the fighting and had gone up into the mountains, particularly Iraqi and Kurdish refugees seeking shelter in northern Iraq. I mean, and if you watch the news today, we're still having similar conversations, right? The Peshmerga are fighting, and the civilians are trapped and being used as human shields. And so this was 1991, so we're still in the same conversation. So I'm just going to not talk through the photographs. I'm going to show you the photographs. This is from northern Iraq, 1991. So after this, I then went on to cover conflicts in Somalia and Mozambique, Eritrea, Afghanistan. So I was in Afghanistan in 2011, 2012. By that time, I was teaching at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And I'll show you a couple slides and tell you more about that in a minute. So how's the pacing on the slides? Doing okay? Okay. This is Somalia. This is the leaflet that was the American soldiers dropped when they were coming. Originally, it was a humanitarian intervention, to help free up the roads for food relief to get through, but then it became a military operation and the hunt for a warlord. They dropped these leaflets, so if you can see it, it's an African-American soldier shaking hands with a Somali, and on the back is some writing. Somali is originally a spoken language, not a written language, so they had to transliterate. And when the Somalis got the leaflet, the translation was not good. They didn't know what they were trying to say, so it was not really effective communication. But they would take these leaflets and trade them for things like cigarettes and bubble gum. So it was effective as a currency, not so much effective as a communication. This is Mozambique and Eritrea. So I skip over that slide because for me personally it's incredibly difficult to look at, but it also I think is an iconic image of war. So that was, there's a long fight between Eritrea and Ethiopia on the border, in particular one fighting for liberation from their side. The Ethiopian soldiers, many were farmers, conscripted into the service, and there were mass graves on the border. And when the seasonal rains would come, all of the bodies would percolate back up out of the mass graves. And so when I think about, animosity and this brother against brother, because in this case, the people would say, no, we don't really hate our brother, but it's our governments, right? But when I see that, I say, that was somebody's father or somebody's son or somebody's husband, right? And nobody deserves to end up like that. And the other thing, whenever I'm doing these stories, I'm also looking for the affirmation of life, that life still goes on and that there are still celebrations. And I always took it as a good sign if there was wedding. If there's still weddings happening, then we're okay. If there aren't weddings happening, yeah, we're in a pretty dark place. I was also looking, by this point in my career, I had the question in my mind, does anything good ever come from war? And in this case, before the war, the women had no right for representation in government, no right to own property. Their marriages were arranged. They couldn't have a business, education. There were a lot of privileges and rights that were not afforded women. And they had a proverb that related women to donkeys. So even though this is in a refugee camp during a rainstorm, but I like the image of the young girl and the donkey because it speaks to their position in the culture and society at the time. So after the war, women did earn the right to own property and to go to college, and many were able to choose their husbands or partners before they ended up at the altar. So some good things did come from it. Now, Eritrea today, another story. The guy who fought the president, freely elected, democratic, in 1993 is still there, right? So it had a moment. And this is from Afghanistan. So this particular one, I went on an air assault mission where you get up in the middle of the night and they put you on a helicopter and they drop you in the middle of nowhere. And then I was actually, the slide's really dark, so on my screen it looks super cool. On your screen, not so much. But my focus on this story was for the women in combat. And at that time, and I always flip the words around, you could be assigned or attached, right? Which one is which? Does anybody remember? Because one says you're here, but you're not really here in terms of legally. You can't get the same level of career advancement as a man until former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta said, yeah, they are in combat. So I had gone to see the women who were the medics, and who were going on patrol. This was an infantry battalion. I went with the 125 Stryker Brigade combat team out of Fairbanks, Fort Wainwright actually, and I spent all my time with the 1-5, the Bobcats, and they had plenty of women serving, several of them as medics, and all of them walking in the same patrol, right? Walk in the same straight line with everybody else. And on that air assault mission, when they dropped us in the middle of nowhere, and I'd been around enough places to know that I was really not happy with this scenario because it was flat as far as the eye could see. And you looked around and you said, wait, we're going to do what? Yeah, we're going to march across this open plain to this village, and the only advice I got was walk in the guy's footsteps ahead of you. I was like, oh man. But it was a really good way to understand, to the best of my ability as a journalist, what that was like, right? It's impossible to walk in somebody else's footsteps for very long, especially in the dark, right? And that's what it was like 1, 2, 3, 4 times a day for the soldiers that we were with. And the other part of this was called the Female Engagement Team, and they learned that the women, in Iraq and Afghanistan, they could have access to the women, whereas the men couldn't. So this was part of their counterinsurgency, the Hearts and Minds, where they would go into villages and talk to the women and try to work with them to set up small businesses, or at least just go in and hear if they had medical concerns or if there was anything they could do to help the women. So if you see a trajectory, yeah, that's what it ended up becoming in my career, looking at the children, looking at the women, on both sides of the coin. So, excellent. So the last thing that I wanted to say was just overall, one, being a child growing up in the military, and then that I learned over my career was to be brave. and not just brave, but brave about the risks you take, but brave as well as being brave in your relationships with people, brave in being able, again, like I said at the beginning, to go out into new situations and take that chance to meet people, to try to hear other people's stories, to learn what it's like for somebody else. So the last time, my life kind of came back full circle, and when I was here at Allegheny, I had Brian Kastner. Does anybody know Brian Kastner's work? He wrote The Long Walk and All the Ways We Kill and Die. Anyway, he came and spoke, Professor Hart here in the front. You want to wave your hand? Who does teach at Allegheny and is herself a veteran. And she brought him to the campus. And he said, Cheryl, would you ever like to do a project together? And I said, sure, but it has to be winter break or summertime, because I'm teaching now. So over our winter break, oh, really? Go away. That's my clock, but it's also my phone, and it's ringing, so we don't want that. We went to Liberia, and again, it had a military component. The 101st was going on a humanitarian mission during the Ebola outbreak. So we wanted to see what's it like to go from an operation where you're fighting insurgents to going to a West African nation where you're fighting Ebola, fighting an epidemic. So that's what we did. I can have my clock back. And if you see again, I was observing predominantly the women's stories. The Liberian people, all of them, men and women, were so brave in the face of this epidemic, working in the hospitals and going out to collect the bodies, because the disease was so contagious that, the basic things that you would do, shake somebody's hand, or, wipe your eyes, or, rub your nose if you had the snuffles, you could transmit it if you'd been in contact with somebody. So we followed them when they would go into the neighborhoods to pick up the bodies, and this is a decontamination team. And then they created a specific cemetery to bury the dead to sort of contain the epidemic. But again, as I've shown in some of the other slides, we were also looking for life in the middle of all of that as well. So we went to places of worship, churches, schools. The schools had been closed and then they opened. And this is called Watch Night. This is New Year's Eve. And it was the first time they had lifted the curfew, and they were able to stay out late. And most of them didn't go partying. They went to church and they prayed and they acknowledged and grieved up until the midnight hour, all the people who had lost. People gave their testimonies, told who had been killed, died, all their suffering. And then it turned into a celebration of praise and thank you for my life, and thank you for this church, and thank you for, the year ahead, and offering up prayers and hope for what was coming next. So moving past and moving forward, which, ultimately I think is beautiful. So I'm going to end with this slide. This is a woman when I first got to Liberia, and if you could say 24 years later, right? 24 years after I'd first gone as a young journalist, and I met Cecilia, and Cecilia sort of changed the trajectory of my life. And I don't know, it would also, like I've said before, come from being that child who grew up being uprooted and sort of facing war, not really knowing what it was, but knowing that, my dad might not come home. So I think that gave me a level of both curiosity and empathy that I brought to my work, but always, always, always remembering that it's not the only thing. Even in the middle of horror and tragedy, the thing that keeps us going is that human spirit, that as brutal as we can be to one another, we can also be incredibly kind and generous. So you look at the people who volunteered in Liberia. When I was in northern Iraq, people in Liberia as well, people would give me shelter or, give me food, tried to help me, which was always staggering to me, right? So I wanted to end there with this. This is just before New Year's Eve, and there's a group of women who go down to the beach. She's not praying to the ocean, but she says when she went to the ocean, she felt closer to God. And so that's where she would offer, they would go down in the morning. They would sleep overnight on the beach, and then when the sun come up, they would get up and pray and offer their Thanksgiving. And especially on that turning of the tide with Ebola, from leaving the ravages of the fall and moving into the new year, there was this transition. So I also like that, and when we think about and we look at me as well, the legacy of war and how it wounds people's hearts and their souls and how it tears apart communities but destroys, people don't necessarily look at the long-term effects of it. And so that's what I've spent a big chunk of my time looking at, but not exclusively, right? I do want to say that everywhere I've gone, no matter how desperate or horrific, there were always moments of hope and light and love and kindness. And so I wanted to leave you with that image. And then I left enough time to answer your questions. And again, there's some veterans who came in a little bit later. I started by saying thank you. Thank you for your service, and please thank your families as well, because that is my childhood, right? So thank you very much. Do y'all have any questions? Yes, sir, in the back of the house.
You came here in 1991 and went to Iraq in the northern part of the Kurds. We turned around and saw Saddam Hussein have his helicopter start killing those Kurds, because that was an atrocity right there. And then the Turks, who hate the Kurds too.
They were caught between the two.
Yes,
exactly.
They were, right like they're right now.
Yep.
And the thing is, and that's a lot of people don't realize, because Mr. Bush, and then the thing when you talk about Somalia, because in 1992, when Mr. Bush lost the election, all of a sudden, oh God, let's go to Somalia, let's go to Yugoslavia, right? Because I know I was down to 171st, they were refueling with, and I remember 2 days after the election, we got orders to send tanker task force over Morel in Spain, which were refueling C-5, C-17s going in down to Djibouti. Ever been to Djibouti?
I haven't had the pleasure of going.
Man, that's a major air base.
I know where it is, though.
Oh, yeah.
Yep, it's hot.
And the thing is, and when we went there and the new elected president was more or less, well, Somalia, huh? Oh, that's interesting. Well, yeah, because come January 20th, now it's your problem.
No, it's exactly right. So what he's saying is in the aftermath of the Gulf War, there had been, if you rise up, we will be there, we will help you, and we didn't. So they were caught, right? And then part two, Somalia, I was there on the beach when the U.S. forces landed December 9th, 1992. So yeah, that's a little more than a month before the transition of power. So yeah. And as I said, it started out as a humanitarian mission, and then it shifted, right? And
that's always the way it does in the military. They make think like we're coming in from an olive branch, and we come with the iron fist.
Yeah.
That's the issue. Because you said you were not in Afghanistan during the 80s.
No. There I was too little for that.
Yeah, well. And remember the thing when we were helping out what they call the Mojahideen or whatever they're
Mojahideen.
Yeah, right. And we were helping them. We were a special operation. Let me think, whose house was it? Well, the Saudi Arabians. And Bin Laden was up there too. And who we were fighting? The Russians. So all I can say is, man, God bless you, because one thing you brought out with that lady right there, there's two things in the United States of America I hope, swear to God, Jesus, don't lose. Hope and compassion. If we lose those two, then we are in the darkness.
Yeah. Which is what I wanted to show is that it is, and I don't want to negate that there's horrific brutality, but every single time I have many personal experiences of profound compassion and bravery and love and hope. And I'd say as a people and as human beings, that's the thing that I hold on to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you? No.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about how your father reacted to your choice to be a combat photographer?
Yeah, so this is the deal. When I was in college, and it's interesting because I had a talk earlier this week, and so there's some, I'm feeling overlaps between what I'm telling you, because I also spoke about my childhood, because the further I get from it, the more I realize how much I am a product of it, and that I remember the first time we moved off a base, right? I was already in high school. I'd never lived anywhere but a military base. And that was a mind bender. So that was incredibly difficult. No, my dad said ROTC, scholarship. And my dad said business degree, practicality. And I said journalist. So the cool thing about as rigorous and disciplined and as my father was, and my parents, my father particularly, they did also say, what you decide we will support. So, and he always, same thing, I'll have your back. Even if you screw up, even if you make a choice I don't like, as long as, tell the truth and be accountable. Those were the two principles. So most of the time I would not tell my parents before I went somewhere, right? So they got pretty good as the years went on. I'll tell you quickly. So Liberia the first time, I didn't tell them, I just went. And this was before any kind of communication, like go in 3 weeks, come out, send a telex. My dad said, Cheryl, we've been watching the news, because he knew I went to Liberia. Wait, they're evacuating Americans. There's a civil war there. And I said, that's exactly right, Dad. And by the way, I'm going back in. And he was like, ah. So I wouldn't have wanted to be my parents. When I went to Afghanistan, I was not going to tell my parents, because I'd been out of it and I decided to go back for a lot of different reasons. One, a student who wanted to cover the conflict, and we spent a year with these soldiers, and they said, well, come down range. And it's like, how do you not do that after you've covered their preparation for the deployment and met their families? So I said, yes, I'll go. And honestly, it was Christmas time, and we got all the way to the air base in Kuwait. And we're literally on the manifest, like 2 hours from taking off. And my friend and former student, JR, said, you have to call your parents. And I said, I can't do it to them. Like, well, just tell them after Christmas, right? And so, bless his heart, he insisted. And I went in and I called my parents, and I said, okay, because they knew I was in Kuwait. I had friends in Kuwait. That was not a surprise. So I said, okay, can you both get on the phone? Are you sitting down? Because I'm going to Afghanistan. And just like this long pause. And then my dad, you can see him process the information. And he understands that I'm going to be with the troops and to tell the stories and to bring that back to the home front, right? And the people in Alaska at the base, they were so grateful because, again, I know from personal experience, they're not telling you what's going on, right? They're not telling you the stories. So I could be on both sides of the fence and hear the stories. And then the sad thing is that in Afghanistan, I got I didn't die, but I almost did. And so that was not a picnic for my parents. And so the last time that I've traveled was Liberia. And again, it was Christmas time. And I went home with the intention of, saying Merry Christmas. But they were like, Cheryl, it's winter break. Why don't you stay? Why don't you stay? And again, cannot tell a lie. I'm like, got other things to do. Love ya, gotta go. The next morning, my father gets up and he's like even when I was a kid, right? The man would block my path and like, okay, what's going on? And I was like, what do you mean, Dad? Your mom knows something's up. So whatever it is, we need to know. I was like, I don't want to tell you. Like, can't you just have a happy Christmas and I'll tell you later? And he said, no. So we sat down in the living room and I said, okay, yes, it's true. I'm traveling. I'm going to do a story. And the sort of beautiful, sad thing was, here's how it went. I can't remember it exactly, but my mom said, you're not going back to Afghanistan. No. You're not going to Iraq. No. Syria? No. Libya? No. And the list went on for about 10 countries. And then my dad went, wait a minute. You are not going to one of those countries in West Africa. And I was like, ding, 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 ding. I'm going to Liberia. And my dad, and he just put his hands down like this and covered his face. And he's like, Cheryl. I said, I know. But to their credit, they always let me go. And I know it wasn't, I know full well it's not fun to be now on the other side of the coin waiting. The Ebola one was tough too. So yeah, I put my parents through some hardship in their time, but they always supported me. Yes? I was going to say sir, and then I saw the patch, and I was like, nope.
I had 22 years Army. My oldest daughter was born in Panama, American born abroad. My youngest daughter was born in Germany,
Like me.
American born abroad. She's born in Landstuhl.
Fulda.
I fully got very well. But in my travels, seen 3 different conflicts, and I've come to the conclusion, lessons and tidings. You know, talking to the Bedouins in Kuwait, you know, I came into Ali Assalim and I know there John and stuff, and talk about where you were at, northern Iraq, the Kurds. I'm familiar with Kirkuk, Erbil,
Yep.
you know, since security. You take southern Iraq, Nasiriyah, I was at Adar Jalil. You take western Iraq, Tel Afar. And I've come to the conclusion that 90% of the people are made up, 90% of the world population made up good people. A lot of them just trying to stay out of the way. And you know, you live through it and you show the pictures, and it's not really the pictures a lot of times, it's the words that you live with. Like a young man, you get ready to go out, you call your PCIs, pre-combat inspection. Private Maccabean, I'm going to get you your E4, your stuff's already straight. But then later on that night, laying on the road with his legs blown off, you're trying to save his life. You think about the last thing he said to that young man. Or the people that you go into an area, you set up a PZ and you knock everything down, and you got people coming in trying to continue their life and stuff. So a lot of people are caught up, but basically the world's a good place. There's a lot of good people in the world, and we have to have an understanding of the people. We can't just paint everybody with one brush. And Iraq was interesting in the fact that it was the cradle of civilization. You get down around Nazarene, you got the ziggurat. You familiar with the ziggurat?
No.
That's where Abraham was born. There's a temple there. You got the Tigris-Euphrates River that run through Iraq. So you took out all the history and stuff like that. And the 2 things I come out of the military with is, 1, when I left the military, I gave up my guns. I don't own a gun anymore. And 2, you kind of look at capacity and empathy. And who are your heroes in life? Like a Nelson Mandela who spent 24 years in bondage and was not bitter, or a Mother Teresa who was born in privilege but gave everything to, you know. So we have a lot to do, but again, the world is not a bad place. A very small percentage of the people cause the world to be bad, you know. And, I wish the best for them people. You see them trying to leave and, you know, get their kids across to get into Europe and stuff. And it is not just a political problem, it's an economic problem, it's an environmental problem. The Middle East has lost all its water.
I would say yes. So the thing, there was something you were saying that I felt over and over and over again. What you're saying is true, that if you just look at anybody, mother, father, we all want the same things, right? If you're a parent, you want to give your children everything and to have them, provide for them and have them have a better life, period. Husband wants to take care of his family. Mother wants to take care of her family. They want their children to grow up in peace and safety, and they want them to have the best that they can have. So we're all aspiring for the same thing, and when we don't see that humanity in one another,
in
it's
February when the dust storms come in, and it'll be black for weeks at a time, all dust, and when it rain mud. And we could not survive in their environment. And what they ask for very little. And so, you know, that term about Make America, we are the greatest country in the world. 1, when you're born, you're blessed to have 10 fingers, 10 toes. And 2, you're blessed to be born in this country. And there's a lot of good people out there. Hopefully we can wrap this stuff up. But we have to have a better understanding of it. We can't paint anybody with a broad brush. When you travel individually, which takes a lot of courage, you met a lot of beautiful people that will offer you anything.
And even at the time, you know, if you would encounter, so I could remember a time when during the first Gulf War, the Gulf War, and I went to Yemen because there was internally displaced people who had been kicked out of Saudi Arabia, people who were left living in practically nothing in their own country. And at that time, President Bush was not very popular and Hosni Mubarak was not very popular. I was an American living in Egypt. And everybody said, Cheryl, don't tell him you're an American. Don't tell him you're an American. And I was like, I am an American. So it's a risk, but time and time again, they're like, we got no problem with you. We're not a fan of your government. I have no problem with you. Come in my shop, have tea. Let me offer you something, you know? So the hospitality and the human connection is there. But yeah, people may disagree on what their governments are doing, for sure. Somebody else, yes?
I was just wondering, like, as a professor, what do you see with your students, when you're talking about all your experiences? Is there anything that you especially are like inspired by that you see in them, or anything that gives you a little, cause for, concern when you see, this younger generation and their perspective on what's going on in the world?
Well, you should be a journalist. That's a very fine question. She's pretty cricket. So what do I find inspiring and what do I find troubling in the...
Could be a concern in this, as these students are, they're hearing so much from you directly, you've been there, but they're also taking in so much from so many forms of media and, drawing different conclusions maybe than...
That's one of the things that I emphasize, and I'm a journalist and I teach journalism, so I teach news literacy. That's my phrase for it, but I give them a news quiz every week, and they grumble and they groan and they think this is outrageous, right? Like, why should we know what's going on? And I was like, okay, let's have a chat. And it's part of what you address, that they're so used to getting little snippets of information all the time. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose, but they don't understand. And what I'm trying to teach is, one, you need to know history so that you can put what's happening into perspective. And two, you need to see what's happening in the world because it's your future, right? I'm here in my life. You are the next step, right? So I am really working on getting them to understand and follow the news and be discerning about the news and be, yeah, I know. I got that whole, see, journalists, we don't miss anything. Even though the last guy was super long, we're going to respect the deadline. So I tell you what, I would be happy to continue talking to you for a few more minutes, and then I'll stay outside for a few minutes, and then I have a plane to catch. So, but to finish that up, the thing that I think is inspiring about the young people is that they really do want to have a better world, and that their hearts are in the right places. And I think if you put together, get them to have that curiosity and get them to have that connection with a bigger, wider world, not just the screen in front of the face, right? I think part of it is you're losing this connection, like sit down and break bread together, sit down and have coffee together. They're not particularly strong, and I'm generalizing, but things that we would do naturally, like ask a stranger for something or to strike up a conversation in the queue in the grocery store, or say hello to some. That, in my experience with the students I've had, that is uncomfortable. So helping them understand how to reach out to other people, not just in a text or in a Snapchat, but to reestablish those human connections and get them to understand that their voice and their hearts and minds are so important for where we go forward, but to get them to understand the bigger picture. So I think there's a lot to be hopeful about, and then my push is just you as a citizen of this planet Earth and this country, you need to know our history and the bigger history. And yes, you actually have to know what's happening in China and what's happening in Saudi Arabia and what's happening in Venezuela, Yes, you do have to know that. This class, you have to know that. So yeah, I think it's important. I'll give a news quiz if a stranger comes in. So if any of you came into my class and I handed you a news quiz, you would get 100%. Not because you crammed for the news quiz 4 seconds before, but because you actually know what's going on in the world. You are of the generation where you are just steeped in it. It's your habit. You read the newspaper, you listen to the radio, right? They feel like they have to cram for the news quiz. Like, no, don't cram for the news quiz, just follow the news. Know what's going on in your world, in your community, in your country, and around the world. Put those pieces together, because if you can put their hearts and their really bright minds and their shiny spirits with that bigger knowledge of humanity, we're good. We got to connect, literally on every level. Not the plug-in thing, but the heart thing, right? Yeah. So I'll stay a few more minutes. Thank you so much for your attention.